Good afternoon. My name is Alex Padilla. I'm the director of the Exploring Economic Freedom project at Metro States, which is a project which is sponsored by the Charles G. Koch Charitable Foundation. The role of that project is to educate people, students in general, about economic freedom and how to promote entrepreneurship, prosperity. And we have also a wide variety of topics surrounding that idea of classical liberalism and economic freedom and political freedom. I'm very pleased to host for the first lecture David Skarbek. David is going to talk about why do prison gangs govern the American penal system. He's a lecturer in the Department of Political Economy at King's College of London in England. Prior to joining the faculty at King's College of London, Dr. Skarbek was the Searle Visiting Assistant Professor in Department of Political Science at Duke University. He also got his Ph.D. in economics at George Mason University. His new book, which is for sale in the back of the room, is entitled The Social Order of the Underworld: How Prison Gangs Govern the American Penal System. He also published over 20 journal articles in journals such as the Journal of Criminal Justice, the Journal of Behavioral Economics, Rationality and Society, Public Choice, the American Political Science Review, and the Journal of Law, Economics and Organizations, among other many journals. I'm very excited to hear what he has to say about it. Please welcome David Skarbek. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm really delighted, excited to be here with you today. It's my first time in Denver. Beautiful city, beautiful campus, beautiful audience. So try to get you on my side. I'm also excited because one of the pieces of scholarship that I think is really important on this question is written by someone on faculty here, a book called Enforcing the Convict Code. And it's a delight to come to the home of someone whose work I really admire. So as an economist, I told my mom I was going to write a book on prison, and she said, why would an economist do that? And the reason is that economists are interested in how rules or institutions shape incentives and behavior. And prison is certainly a place where rules are prominent and very important. So my goal was to think of prisons from that economics perspective. And when economists and political scientists think about rules and institutions, we'd like to use this term governance institutions. And governance institutions do a variety of things that we think are useful. One is that they define and enforce property rights. So the fact that I can call the police or take someone to court over a commercial transaction, that provides security to my control of resources, right? Likewise, governance institutions help people engage in trade. So the knowledge that there's an arena for adjudicating disputes gives me assurance ex ante and helps me do more business. And what studies around the world show is that when these governance institutions are effective and set up in the right manner, economies become more prosperous and are more peaceful. When the governance institutions create incentives that lead to redistribution or to violence, then there's less prosperity and less peace. So the rules of the game, the governance institutions, are crucial for explaining outcomes that we care about around the world. And I want to take that framework to understand the prison situation. These governance institutions are provided through governments very often, as the examples I gave suggest, but not all of the governance must be provided by governments. If you go and use eBay, you can either give someone a thumbs up or a thumbs down based on their behavior in some transaction. That's an informal check on bad behavior, so it's a form of extra-legal governance. So that's what I'm going to talk about today, governance institutions. Now to prison gangs. I define prison gangs as inmate organizations whose membership is restrictive. It's mutually exclusive so that you can be a member of one and only one, not multiple, and membership is permanent. Very often the permanency of membership extends for the individual's life. People in gangs often identify their gang affiliation through tattoos. This gentleman has a Fresno tattoo across the top of his chest and indicates in a very credible and clear manner with which group he's affiliated with. And if you look, you can see that on his chest he has tattoos of bulldogs. It's associated with the university near Fresno, which has a bulldog as a logo. So these tattoos are excellent ways to indicate with which gang a person affiliates. They're very permanent, you can't remove them. They're very prominent so that they're easily seen. Another common, almost universal feature of prison gangs is racial and ethnic segregation. So this gentleman has a white power tattoo across his forehead. It illustrates the fact that these groups are, at the very least, limited on racial and ethnic criteria, but also very often by other factors, such as geographic factors. The first prison that existed in California was opened in 1851. And for more than 100 years, no groups like those prison gangs I just described operated within their prisons. In 1957 and through the 1960s, there was the formation of several prison gangs. They grew somewhat slowly in numbers, but their influence certainly increased over that period. After the 1970s, the importance of gangs in the California prison system has increased even more. They dominate the inmate social system and have a dramatic influence on the everyday life of prisoners. So as a social scientist, that's the puzzle that I'm interested in. Why is something that's so important today absent for more than a century? What can we do to try to explain that historical variation? So my answer is that it's going to be the effective extra-legal governance institutions changed between those periods. So my argument is that gangs form and operate to provide governance, to define and enforce property rights, and to facilitate trade when officials cannot or will not do so. So why might inmates seek out extra-legal governance? Why don't officials provide all that they demand? I want to argue that there's at least three key reasons why. There's obviously lots of formal governance in prison. There are correctional officers monitoring people's interactions, perhaps protecting you. The same bars, they keep you locked in at night, but they also keep other people locked out, right? Thus providing some level of security. There's three key ways where inmates need to supplement or substitute for those formal governance institutions. The first is that on the margin, inmates have an incentive to invest in a little more security of their person and their property. This is an overcrowded dormitory in a California prison. Thankfully, there are not nearly as many dormitories like this now as there were a few years ago when this was taken. But I want you to just get a look at it and get a sense about how you might feel if you were in that environment. You know, a couple hundred men in that room, 3 bunks to a bed. There'll be a few correctional officers there to ensure the safety of everyone and the security of their property, or at least that's what they're tasked with. If you want to take a nap in the middle of the afternoon like this individual, or you have something valuable, you can put it in a lockbox. But what I want to suggest is that in an environment like this, it would be very reasonable for you to say, I'm glad that there's some security of property, but I'm going to take additional steps to increase the security that I have of my property. Violence is less frequent in American prisons than it was 40 years ago, but bad things still happen. This is a few clips from a riot that took place that lasted about 20 minutes. The potential for chaos, for violence like this, is something that people very rationally take steps to avoid. The white poofs of smoke are from the pepper spray that guards are sending down to the yard to try to control the inmates. In an environment where this is something that's more plausible, more possible than in, say, the university environment, people are rational to take a few extra steps to try to prevent themselves from being harmed should something like that happen. So the first reason why inmates require extra legal governance is because they want a little more protection of their property rights. The second has to do with this problem. So I actually got this off of Google Maps. It's the prison yard at San Quentin, or one of them. Can anyone guess what those inmates are doing?
Brawling.
Brawling? It looks like they're brawling. Anyone else? Yeah, in the back. They're playing basketball. They're actually playing basketball. And if you look, I think it's maybe 2-on-2 or 3-on-3, depending on what's going on there. But if you look here, you can see the shadow from this hoop on the other side of that fence. So what I want to argue or contend is that in prison, there are many common resources that are in theory available to all. But this picture would suggest that the demand for those activities, for those resources, exceeds the supply of them. There are more people who want to play basketball than are basketball places available to play, right? There's other features of the prison environment that people all in theory have access to, but need to be allocated because of shortages. Using handball courts, controlling tables, when to watch TV, where to stand in the prison yard. Each of these things are common resources that officials don't typically allocate to the inmates. So one inmate explains, he says, somebody wants to control this basketball court or that basketball court or this weight bench or that weight bench. The CO, correctional officers, what we call prison guards, has nothing to do with that. That's amongst the inmates, the convicts. Sometimes you can maybe talk it out, get it settled without the violence. Sometimes you have to bring the violence. So they're talking about different mechanisms, different rules of allocating common resources. Another inmate says if a new yard opens up, you're going to fight for that handball court, you're going to fight for some tables. If you ain't a northerner, particular gang affiliation group, and you come into that area, you're going to get stabbed. So the second reason why inmates require extra legal governance is because officials don't allocate control of common resources. The third reason has to do with the underground economy. These are some of the 15,000 mobile phones confiscated from inmates in 2011. Okay? At any interdiction rate that's plausible, that means that a substantial portion of inmates have their own cell phone. Okay? Those who don't very often have their own SIM cards. They'll rent a phone, put their SIM card in, and make use of it for as long as they've rented it. So there's a lot of cell phones in California prisons. A recent random drug test of inmates found that 23% of inmates tested positive for some illicit substance. Another 30% refused to take the test. Okay? Presumably some portion of those 30% knew their test would come back positive, dirty. So if that's the case, anywhere between 23 and 51% of inmates randomly sample have drugs in their system. Okay? The access that inmates have to cell phones, drugs, alcohol is clearly there, it's clearly available. Now what's unique about this for prisoners is that because it's contraband, you can't go to officials to govern transactions over these things. You can't go to an official and complain that the heroin that you made a deal for isn't of the quality that you wanted, or the quantity, or it didn't arrive in a timely enough fashion, right? The illicit nature of those contraband activities mean that to adjudicate disputes in that situation, you can't rely on officials. You have to create ways to provide assurance for trade in an environment characterized potentially by untrustworthy people. So that's the three reasons why inmates require extra legal governance. What I want to do is describe two different periods of life in California prisons, or American prisons, depending on how we want to think about it. And I want to look at the ways that extra legal governance is provided by inmates in two different periods, and look at the different ways that they provide governance. Prior to the period that prison gangs formed in the 1950s, inmates lived in line with what researchers and many inmates call the convict code, or the code. So basically a set of behaviors that they deemed to be acceptable or appropriate, that they thought was in line with their standards. According to one early, fairly famous study on the subject, it includes some of the following dictums, right? Don't inform on people, don't lie to people, don't talk all the time, don't steal from people, pay your debts back, don't be weak, don't whine all the time. Some of a reasonable set of values and behaviors that they expected from other inmates. So how do these norms provide extra legal governance? Well, in this sort of decentralized system, a person's reputation was very important. To the degree that you lived up to these standards, you were respected by other people, you had access to more resources, you were less likely to be targeted for victimization. To the extent that you deviated from these, you caused conflict. If you were the person who was always stealing, always lying, always talking poorly and gossiping about other people, then that causes conflict. You would lose access to resources and the abilities to protect yourself, and would be more likely to become a target. In that way, the threat of your reputation being diminished provided a check on your acting badly. If you anticipate that I don't want to lose sight in the eyes of other people because of those costs, then I'm going to try to live in a way more consistent with what people value and expect. So this system was very decentralized. There was not the level of organized groups that exist in prisons today. Enforcement was usually unilateral. An individual could choose to enforce violations of these norms or not. According to one study, the convict code provides the legal environment of the sub rosa system, or the underground economy. So what I want to do is characterize inmate society in that period as being much more fluid and decentralized than it is today. Prisons today, in particular in California, are much more organized and hierarchical. They operate along what an economist might call a community responsibility system, based on gang or race affiliation. This might be a good point to clarify gang and race. So these gangs are racially and ethnically segregated. And there's sort of three tiers I like to think of the degree of strength of gang affiliation. There are those, what in California they call security threat group 1 people. These are members of the oldest traditional prison gangs. These are the made members of prison gangs, if we want to use that term. Security threat group 2 are members of newer, less permanent, less entrenched prison gangs and a variety of different street gangs. So the affiliation is a bit less than that highest tier of affiliation. And then what characterizes, I think, most inmates is sort of a third tier, which is that they're not gang affiliated, they're race or ethnicity affiliated. Now, if you have to affiliate with your racial and ethnic group, what happens in that group is largely influenced by the activities of those other more strongly affiliated gang members. So the system as it works today, this community responsibility system, works as follows. Each member of the community, of the prison, is associated with some group, and the distinguishing characteristic of the system is that each person in a group is responsible for the actions, debts, obligations of other members in that group. So to use an example, if a member from this green group receives some drugs from the red group with the promise to repay twice as much in the following week, if that individual doesn't do it, it's not just that individual who's responsible for the debt, it's everyone in that group who's responsible for the debt, because he's one of their members. To be resolved could be resolved in a number of different ways. It may be that the gang is able to force the delinquent member to pay off the debt. It may be that they collect the resources to pay off that debt. Very commonly, the delinquent individual will have to work off the debt for the other group, maybe assault an enemy of the other gang. Frequently, violence is used to resolve these situations. They may hand him over to the other group to be assaulted in a controlled fashion, in a cage fight, cell fight. What is, I guess, maybe most interesting, although maybe not the most frequent, is that the members will assault their delinquent member themselves. So they'll say, "We are going to impose a cost to your satisfaction." Now, what's interesting about this system is, in the previous period, it was the individual that matters. In this period, it's the group that matters. In the previous period, it was the individual's reputation that determined what access to resources existed. If someone had a good reputation, you'd interact with them in social context and economic exchange. In this situation, you don't need to know each individual's reputation. What you need to know is the reputation of the group that you affiliate with, of the group that the person affiliates with. So it may be that you don't know any particular member of this group, but you may be willing to engage in some economic exchange because you know that the group as a whole has a responsibility for taking responsibility, has a reputation for taking responsibility of its members. It's much more different than the decentralized system. It's much more centralized. It allows people with low costs of monitoring members, your own group, to monitor against bad behavior. And in doing so, it allows strangers to engage in social and economic interactions that are potentially mutually beneficial. So just a few quotes kind of illustrate the flavor of this. One white inmate, he says, "It was my responsibility on the yard to ensure that our people were not harmed by another race." He says, "I took care of the drug debts. If one of our people became delinquent in a drug debt to another race, it was my responsibility to either cover their drug debt or have them stabbed, in which case we would send one of ours to stab them." So that's a nice, succinct way of explaining the community responsibility system. Another inmate explains he had used a racially derogatory term when he was fairly new to prison. He says, "The next thing I know, I'm told to make it right with them. At first I thought, you gotta be kidding me. No way am I gonna tell this guy that I'm sorry. Then they told me that I have no choice. That's the rule. You do what you're told. They made a very good argument about how I need to fall in line. Okay, so I made things right. So there are incentives in certain situations for violence or conflict to be controlled by these groups. And that control comes from your own group members. Another line explains, we need to keep the boys in line. If one of our guys is a hothead or something and is always shooting off his mouth, it can get everyone into trouble. We don't want to lock down, we don't want to riot. If one of my guys is messing up, then we either offer him up to the other guys or we take him down ourselves. So again, here's this idea is that when acts of violence or conflict have external effects, some people in some situations have incentives to try to reduce that violence, to reduce that unsettling of social order. In order to do so, gangs and inmates rely on fairly extensive writing processes. When a new inmate arrives at a prison, the shot caller, or leader for the particular racial and ethnic group, will send an informal questionnaire. Inmates call it a new arrival questionnaire, an NAQ, and it's going to ask information about that new inmate. What's your name? What's your street name? Where have you been incarcerated? What crimes have you committed? What street gangs or prison gangs have you been affiliated with? They're going to try to find out who this person is and where he fits into the ecology of life. They're going to double check that information that they collect informally with the formal paperwork in the prison. And then they're going to double check that name, that person's name, usually against something that's called a variety of things: an enemies list, a no good list, a bad news list. Lists of people who have violated gang rules in the past and who the gang members feel deserve some sort of punishment. Okay? This one is from the 1990s, so it's quite a bit old, but they're longer today than apparently they used to be. And it lists 3 different types of people. The biggest section are the personals, okay? And these are individuals who deserve punishment according to the gang members who collect this information. So there's this guy, Greedy. Greedy comes into the prison, you check it out, figure out who he is. When he gets onto this list, when they see that he's on the list, there's going to be consequences for that. He's not going to be integrated into the program as quickly as someone who's not on the list. The top category are the disciplines. These aren't individuals, but entire gangs, any member of whom should be dealt with if they happen to end up in that incarceration facility. So 8th Street, East LA gang. So in the same way that people in prison often work along a community responsibility system, the street gangs also have a community responsibility system as well. Other members of the group can be held accountable for their actions. So the potential that you would end up on a list like this encourages compliance with gang rules, gang rulings, and gang dictates. An important category is passes. These are the people who used to be in the other 2 categories, but have made right for whatever their wrong was, and so they've got a pass now. Their transgressions have been forgiven. And what's crucial, it's important to have that, right? The first 2 create incentives to not act in a way that's undesirable to them in the first place. But if there's no way that you can be forgiven for your sins, so to speak, then you'll only fight, right? You'll only push back. There's no way to resolve the situation in a less costly manner than violence. So the ability to be protected encourages people to make right what these people feel they've done wrong. So, former correctional officer, she explains the level of gang importance in prison. She says, when you come to prison, you have to join a gang. You have no choice. It's a must. Because you have no protection, you're on your own, and anything can happen to you. Now, here she says gang, but she really means race. So it doesn't mean that you have to be one of these security threat group 1 or 2. It means you have to affiliate with the racial and ethnic group that you're associated with, often your car, your county, people from your county. A former warden at San Quentin said in a very public interview, he said, the Department of Corrections has pretty much given over control of the general populations to gangs. Pretty remarkable admission, right, from someone who's in a leadership role in what was just previously the nation's biggest prison system. So if you remember before, I said prison gangs are important today, but they weren't before. How do we make sense of that? So what I've tried to do is explain or argue, describe how these different systems look. Now I want to provide an explanation to make sense of that change. And the key is to understand when certain types of governance institutions work better or worse. So I call this earlier period, that convict code era, as reputation-based governance, or reputations are effective when they're norms, when they're based on these norms, right? So norm-based or reputation-based governance. So what we can do is draw on a very large literature across the social sciences that looks at when norms work well and when they don't look well. And we can take those as, empirical propositions if we want, or we can take those as explanations and see if it explains the historical variation about when gangs are important and when they're less important. So identify kind of 4 demographic changes that should undermine the effectiveness of norms to facilitate social and economic activity, to provide governance. The first is that norms work much less well, they're much more ineffective when you have large populations. And the way to really get a good grasp of that is to think about the difference between a small community of 5, 10, 15 people and a big area, maybe as big as Denver. The power of norm-based governance is that your reputation may be diminished. If people don't know what your reputation is, good or bad, then the threat of of reputations being diminished doesn't encourage good behavior, right? No one knows if you're good or bad, then there's less incentive for you to do good. So in large populations, the information costs associated with learning people's reputations increases, meaning the incentive is less powerful to constrain bad behavior ex ante. There's a second reason why the size of the population, when it increases, undermines norm-based governance, which is that in a system of decentralized punishment, where there's not a particular individual designated to punish violations of the norm, then punishment is a public good, right? And people have an incentive to free ride on the provision of public goods because you bear the costs and others enjoy the benefits. So in larger populations, it aggravates the problems of public good provision. So we should think norms would be less effective. The second is that norms are less effective if you don't know what the norms are, right? If you don't know what the norms are, you're going to violate them, cause conflict. And if you don't know what the norms are, then you can't identify other people violating them, and you can't punish people who violate the norms. So knowledge of the norms is crucial for their effectiveness. The third is that norms are less effective, I'm sorry to say, when there are more young people involved, right? There's a lot of debate about why that might be the case. I see a few smiles, so it might not be a totally controversial claim to make. Young people have an incentive to experiment. The benefits to finding something new, they'll enjoy for the rest of their lives. When you get old, you've only got a few years left, just stick with what you know, right? So there's a lot of reasons why young people might undermine norms by seeing, well, I don't think this is good, I'm going to try something else. And that undermines the conformity that facilitates norm-based governance. And then finally, norms are less effective when there's greater social distance, or we could say greater social heterogeneity. I'm being a kind of intentionally ambiguous in what precisely we mean by that, because the characteristics that we possess, the characteristics of the communities that we're in are incredibly multifaceted. Think about very homogeneous communities. Think of the Amish, for example. In the Amish community, norms are much more effective. And they're more effective because everyone agrees what the appropriate norm should be. They agree what a deviation from those norms would be. They agree on what the appropriate punishment for deviations of norms is. So the more homogeneity in the way that we view norms, the more effective they are, because we all know what the norm is and the violation of it, and we all know that everyone else knows, right? The common knowledge promotes norm-following behavior. In many homogeneous communities, there's also shared religious and cultural symbols, practices, beliefs. Those can also facilitate decentralized norm-based governance. So those are kind of 4 causes according to the broader literature, that should explain when norms fail. So I'll look at a little bit of data that's kind of consistent with these claims. The first looks at the size of the inmate population. Prior to 1920 in California, population was always about fewer than 3,000, on average about 1,000 inmates. During the period that prison gangs formed, it increases about 5-fold. It's a greater number of inmates than ever previously, a greater rate of increase, and a more sustained increase than ever before. If we pull that data out closer to now, we see an increase, that was on the last slide, and of course, along with the rest of the country, dramatic increases in the incarceration rate, and the number of people being there, importantly. So what I want to argue is that this world is a world of higher information costs than this world. This is a world down here where you can have a better sense about what someone's reputation is than in a world here. It's easier for decentralized reputations, norm-based governance to work in this world. There's also an increase in average total inmates per facility from about 1,000 to upwards of 3,000 and 4,000. And of course, the number of prisons in California has increased as well, from 4 or 5 to, I believe, 34 now. Now, more prisons can make even worse the problem of more people. The fact that inmates are spread across different prisons means that communicating to other individuals is more costly than if they were in the same location. Add to that the fact that people transfer between different prisons, and that makes it more difficult to sustain credible information about someone's reputation. Each of those factors means that reputations, the threat of a diminished reputation, are a less powerful check on your behavior. Norms are more effective if people know them. How do we know if people know norms? One imperfect measure is to look at the percentage of people who have served a prior prison commitment before now. Right? If you've never been to prison before, then you're less likely to know what the convict code entails, how it should be applied in a variety of settings. What this data, which note is much fewer years than the last few, shows is that during the period that prison gangs formed, the percentage of inmates arriving to prison with a prior prison commitment falls from about 60% to about 35%, right? So during the period that there are more prisoners, there are also more prisoners who've never been in prison before. New inmates are often, or at least used to be called, fresh fish. And one of the explanations for that is because if you take a fish that's fresh out of the water, what do? They flop around, they are not coincident with their community, they are awkward, they don't know what they're supposed to be doing. Well, that's the new inmate. That new inmate doesn't know what's going on. A famous sociologist calls it prisonization, learning the behaviors, attitudes, values, and process of prison life. A study of long-term serial felony offenders in California in the 90s. So these people went and talked to people who'd been in prison for a long time in California, and they asked them about the convict code. They asked them how things have changed. They said nobody respects the convict code in the same way anymore. And these inmates, according to the summarizing assessment of the scholars who did the study, had not been socialized into the convict culture, and the rules and codes of behavior were no longer adhered to. So that newness of inmates undermined that code, that ability for that code to work. The fourth argument for why norms fail or the third argument, is more young people around. And the number of young males, this is under the age of 30 and under the age of 20, has, along with the increase in the prison population, increased dramatically. So in the 1950s, there was maybe, 2,500 inmates entering prison each year under the ages of 25. And in the 2000s, that number is consistently over 15,000. So each one of these demographic changes undermines the ability for reputations to matter, for a decentralized adherence to convict code to matter. And then finally, another imperfect measure of social heterogeneity is to look at racial and ethnic background. Okay? Imperfect in many ways, but one possible measure. And what we see is that in 1951, there was 2 white inmates in prison for every black and Hispanic inmate. And that's reversed tremendously, such that now there are 3 black or Hispanic inmates for every 1 white inmate. And what that shows is that the power that people have to control resources has shifted dramatically amongst racial and ethnic groups. There's another measure that I use that I don't have a slide for called ethnic fractionalization, which is a measure of it's the approximate probability that if you draw 2 people randomly from a community that they'll be of the same type. That's increased about 40% as well during this period. So prisons have changed in their racial and ethnic composition and have become more diverse. And each one of those are going to push against the effectiveness of norm-based governance. So during this period where demographic changes have occurred, in the 1970s in California, we see a spike in violence. We see a spike in conflict. There's more stabbings, there's more assaults, there's more murders. And the Department of Corrections, if you look back through their paperworks and their archives during this time, they dig into them and they say they recognize that something has changed, that there's a problem here throughout the 1960s, early 1970s. My argument is that that fits well with what we know about norms. If these demographic changes undermine norms, then we would expect more conflict to take place, to emerge, right? The weakness of the norms gives rise to the conflict. In the face of this conflict, inmates sought out alternatives. So several inmates started forming gangs. Okay? When you read the histories of these groups by former members, by correctional officers, the consistent claim that keeps coming up is that gangs form initially for protection. They want protection for themselves. And in a dangerous environment, I think it's very reasonable that people would seek that out. So as the power of decentralized norms falls, a different centralized form of control, of governance emerges. It enforces many of the same precepts or ideas in the convict code, and inmates still refer to the code and the convict code. But the way in which those needs for governance is met has switched very much from decentralized to centralized. Now, the formation of these gangs for protection had a consequence. In order for a group to effectively protect their members, they have to have a credible threat of violence. Don't hurt us or we'll use violence against you. That gives them a substantial advantage in the underground economy. Think of a sole proprietor in this era. You've got something valuable. You've got a bundle of heroin. Well, to benefit, to profit from that, you have to make its presence known to other people. And those other people may say, look, he has a bundle of heroin, let's just take it from him. And a sole proprietor may have few options to not be robbed from. The gang, on the other hand, has a built-in protection against that. Because they have a credible threat of violence that generates the protection for themselves, it also protects their property and their resources. So there's an environment now where the people who are best poised to benefit from underground economic activity are the gangs. And after these gangs form, we can look at some other rough measures that suggest that there was an increase in demand for what they could provide. So this is data that asks inmates about addictions to illicit substances. And what we see is that from 1959 to 1984, the total number of inmates entering prison who admitted having an addiction increases from about 1,500 to about 12,000 or 10,000 to 12,000. So there are many more people who are potential demanders, potentially have a demand for drugs. The percentage of inmates, of these inmates, increases from about 30% of new inmates to more than 70% of arriving inmates. So there are more people who maybe don't want to use drugs, but there's a potential for them to do so, right? This is a demand. This is a latent demand for a product that gangs profit substantially from providing. Here's a related measure we can look at. This is people entering California prisons for drug offenses. Now, it's absolutely true that many people who are convicted of drug offenses don't use drugs, but we know that many of them do, and that many people who are convicted and sent to prison did have drugs or alcohol in their system during the time that the crimes were committed. It's fairly low and stable until 1980, when the war on drugs is really enhanced. The number of people in prison and entering prisons enters the 10,000s, right? So there are many more people in prison, and what that represents in general is just more opportunity for people to buy things. But in particular, there's a segment of people in the market who want to buy something that officials don't provide, right? If you want to buy pens and paper, you can go to the commissary, or you can buy it from one of the gangs if they were selling it. If you want to buy a bundle of heroin, you can't go to the commissary for it. So we've got more demand for profitable products that are controlled for organizational reasons by the gangs. According to one interview, there's something very interesting here about the incentive that creates, right? So the gentleman says, we don't fight in a riot and stuff unless we have to. If I'm locked down, then I'm not working. You can make some serious bank in prison, and shot callers hate it when you're in lockdown. And this hints at something that's unexpected, maybe perverse, maybe providential, which is that the fact that gangs profit so much from underground economic activity means they have some incentives to limit chaotic acts of violence, public acts of violence, right? The concern is that if there's a big fight, they'll all go on lockdown and they won't make money selling drugs, alcohol, other contraband in the underground economy. So some vested interest in profiting, in money making, can create some incentive to diminish socially disruptive acts of violence. None of that is to say that they don't use violence often. They do it in a more controlled fashion. Instead of a fight in the yard, they'll have a cell fight. They'll arrange fights where they're not going to be observed. So that's my argument, is that historically, the best way to understand the observed variation in prison gang activity is to look at the need for governance. And under some conditions, that governance can be decentralized. In others, the centralization of gangs makes a lot of sense to them. And I'd also maybe just note that the community responsibility system is almost identical to clan-based systems of governance that exist throughout the world today and throughout history. So that need to be responsible for other people, to vouch for other people, is actually a very common social and economic institution to provide governance. I thought I'd talk for a few minutes about some alternative explanations for why gangs are so important today. And I'm going to try to tell you that they're not very good, and mine's a little bit better, so you should believe mine, okay? So, take this all with a critical eye. Violence. A casual review of any journalistic account of gangs is to call them violent prison gangs. Officials, James Beard, head of the Department of Corrections in California, says that gangs have an agenda of violence. Okay? If that's true, then we should expect that with the gangs comes more violence. That would seem to be a kind of a clear prediction. But that's not the case. So across the United States, prison violence has been declining for a number of years. This is data on the frequency of prison riots per 100,000 inmates. And in the 1970s, it was frequently, all up here, big numbers. By the early 2000s, the rate of prison riots per 100,000 has diminished substantially. There are much fewer riots than there used to be. This is data on the inmate homicide rate in state correctional facilities. It fell 94% between 1973 and 2003. And in 2003, the homicide rate in prison was lower than in the general population. Okay? Certainly lower than many of the communities that inmates come from. Inmate assaults have declined, but not as much. So 43 per 1,000 to about 30 per 1,000 in 2000. So we don't see as dramatic declines, which I think if you consider the substantial improvements in medical technology, we should see a greater drop in inmate homicide than simply assaults. And it hasn't necessarily come from greater use of maximum security or administrative segregation. So this looks at the percentage of state prison inmates under the maximum security. In 1974, it's about 45. It got an increase, turns, 2000, it's a bit dated, but it's about 30. It's not that everyone is much more in much secure facilities, and that buys the decline in violence. We can also look at the percentage of inmates who have been who are held in administrative segregation, and that has remained the same between 1973 and 2003. As an economist and a political scientist, when we study violence, the one thing that is just entirely apparent is that violence is costly. Right? Violence is very costly. It's costly to use energy to hurt someone. It's costly because you might be hurt when carrying out that violence. So Thomas Schelling studied the Cold War for many years and actually wrote, he was influential in writing this movie about, I'm forgetting the name now. Do you know this movie where they've got the nuclear bomb situation in Russia and the US? It's Dr. Strangelove. So he wrote that. He wrote a lot of that script, and the reason is because he cared about strategic issues involving violence. So what Tom Schelling says is that violence is costly. People want to avoid costs. The best threats are the ones that don't have to be carried out. So it's not violence that gangs want, it's the threat of violence that they never have to follow through on that they want. That explains or is consistent with the data that we see. Another popular explanation is the importation theory, which is the idea that street gangs come into existence in the community and they import their organizational structure into the prison setting. In the case of Illinois, that seems to describe things very well, but I want to argue that that's probably not a very helpful explanation of where we see gang activity. So according to the importation theory, if there are street gangs present in the community, then that's going to lead to prison gang activity. If there's no street gang activity in the community, then there's no one to import their structure into the prisons. So this is data from a study by the Department of Justice that lists the years in different states when prison gangs are first identified as being active. What we see when we look at it is that for many states, Utah, Pennsylvania, Iowa, Nevada, Arkansas, North Carolina, these are states where prison gangs form very early, but there's not substantial street gang presence. Right? There is no one to import their structure into these prison systems. These are also not just places where the first prison gang members are identified, but the size of membership, the number of members, is most substantial in these places with no street gang presence. Think about California. That is a case that's in some sense consistent with the importation theory. Gang capital of the world, Los Angeles, right? These fantastic claims. There were street gangs there for a long time, and prison gangs formed there at a very early period. But I think it's not quite entirely fit in with the theory for the following reason. The street gangs in California have existed at least since the 1930s, according to some people by the 1910s, but prison gangs don't come out until 1957, 1960s, right? So if it's the street gangs that matter, why is there a 30 or possibly 50-year lag in when street gangs are able to import their structure? There's got to be something more complicated going on. And of course, when we drill down and look at the history of what those prison gang members were or what they were doing, the Mexican Mafia is a group that formed not from a single group that imported its organizational structure, it formed from many different gangs, and they didn't recreate the structure of their street gangs. They created a different structure. So they imported nothing organizationally of their gangs on the streets. And the second prison gang, the Nuestra Familia, is a group that was specifically targeted for violence in prison because they weren't criminally minded. They were farm workers. They were rural people who weren't kind of skilled in these sorts of criminal activities that members of the Mexican Mafia were. They weren't importing a structure. There was no structure. So my argument is that street gangs matter, but they don't matter to the extent and in the way that this importation theory suggests they do. We can talk more about it in Q&A if people are interested, but the basic idea is that street gang members are obviously very frequently involved with the gangs because they have a comparative advantage in providing the extra legal governance in the prisons. That's often what they do on the streets, so who better than to take over those roles in prison? A third common explanation, especially with nonprofit groups, is that gangs form to promote hateful ideologies, racist hateful ideologies. And there's no doubt that there are many racist prison gang members or racist people in prison who get racist symbols put on their bodies. So I entirely agree with that. But the question is, can we explain where prison gangs are active by the preferences, the prejudice that the inmates possess? And I want to say that that's not so clear. First of all, many inmates say they're not racist. They say, I live in a racist environment, a segregated environment, and I have no choice. And surely many of them have no choice but to go along with the way things work there, certainly on an individual basis. The second is that measures of prejudice and racism have certainly been falling since at least the 1940s. Now again, we can step back and say, well, it's more difficult to observe or people won't admit it. But in a world where measuring these types of beliefs is very imperfect, there's lots of evidence to say that things are at least getting better. But they're getting better, they're declining at the same time that we see prison gangs emerging and becoming more important. So that doesn't fit the kind of general trends very well. One inmate said something, this is a little bit of a paraphrase, I didn't quite get the quote right, said something like, people hear Aryan brotherhood and they get hung up on the first word, Aryan, but they overlook the brotherhood part. And this fits my story, which is that the brotherhood, the community responsibility system, is a crucial part of this, right? It's not just Aryan, it's brotherhood, right? It's the group that matters. So it's very reasonable to then ask, why the Aryan, right? Why isn't it Scrabble players' brotherhood or something else? I want to suggest that in some but not all cases, it is more about brotherhood than Aryan. The difficulty is for a community responsibility system to work well, it has to be easy to identify who affiliates with who. Okay? In an earlier quote, there's an individual who insulted someone else and has to apologize. It's very easy for that person to know, for the person who was insulted to know who to go to, because you can read someone's face. You can see someone's face and know which group they affiliate with. In an environment where everyone is male, wears basically the same clothes, have many of the same haircuts, and are even in a conscribed age range, right, for males, everyone doesn't look the same, but there's not a lot of distinguishing characteristics available. So an alternative to race or ethnically based segregation could be religious ones. But the problem is that it's much less easy to distinguish an Episcopalian from a Baptist than maybe a white person from a black person, right? So there's something that may be useful, even if it's kind of undesirable in many other ways about that type of segregation. I'll skip over my next explanations, or the next ones that are wrong, and just move on to some concluding arguments here, okay? So my basic argument is that gangs form to provide governance. They're important today because of the conditions that exist, the demographic conditions. They're costly to create and to operate. So in periods where demographics are more conducive to decentralized governance, people forego gang creation. And I argue this explains the historical variation in California and the United States. It helps us explain why some state prison systems have more and less serious gang problems. Texas and California, big prison systems, big prison gang problem. New Hampshire, Wyoming, Vermont, small prison gangs problem or none, small prison systems. So it helps us explain within the US. I've got an argument about how it explains male and female in general versus gay and transgender dorms. I'll skip that unless anyone's interested. And I think potentially this helps us better explain prison social order around the world. So where I live in England and Wales prison systems don't have anywhere near the same prison gang problem that we do in California. Much less permanent, much less prominent, much less influential, okay? Well, they also have a much smaller prison system, okay? Their prisons hold, there was a report that just came out recently, and there was widespread disapproval of the prison crowding of something like 650 inmates into one prison, okay? Compare that with thousands of inmates in prisons in California. So they have much smaller prisons. According to my argument, we should expect gangs to be less important. And then we can look around the world elsewhere, Latin America, right? The governance provided by officials is often just to keep people in. Inmates have to provide all the other governance, right? How the food is, is obtained, distributed, how disputes are resolved. All of the governance is, decentralized or outsourced to the inmates. Places like Scandinavia, if you've seen pictures of, Norwegian prisons, it's shocking. It's much larger than my flat in London, okay? The formal governance is in abundance, and since it is in abundance, we shouldn't expect inmates to have to provide or create as much. So, if I'm right, what would the implications be for policy or for prison management? I think the first is that we need to change the focus of gang control. Almost unanimously, officials have used suppression strategies, what I call supply-side strategies. You're in a gang, you go to the shoe. You're in a gang, we take your privileges. They're targeting the people who are supplying governance. The problem is that this isn't just a supply problem, this is a demand problem. If inmates have demand for what's being provided, then when you remove one supplier of governance, someone else is going to step into that place. And that's consistently what officials say. We lock one up, 10 more fill in that role. If you were to shut down every bar in Denver tonight, but allow people to open bars tomorrow, would we have bars tomorrow? Probably, at least in a week, right? If there's a demand for what's being provided, then you can't just target the supply side. And the greater severity and punitiveness of the housing that we put gang members in is counterproductive. So instead, we focus on the demand side. If inmates seek out gangs for safety, why don't we make prisons safer? Shocking, right? Why don't we make prisons safe so they don't have to rely on other inmates for safety? We should, I think, question what is available and what is contraband in prison. In California, I think since 2005 is when they outlawed cigarettes. They still get cigarettes, but where do they get them from? The gangs. Every time items are made unavailable, it creates a profit opportunity for these groups, and it empowers them. It increases their influence. And if you don't want that, like I don't want that, then liberalizing prison economy in reasonable ways, rational, safe ways, can undercut their ability to be powerful. More generally, I think that smaller prisons are safer prisons. It's kind of one of these things that as a social scientist, it's tough to rigorously measure, but that's kind of my sense. Smaller prisons are easier to control, easier to watch inmates, easier to protect inmates. So in addition to making prisons safer through a variety of other techniques, maybe smaller prisons, might be a way to undermine the services that gangs provide that inmates demand. As many people here will know, the U.S. incarcerates more people than every country in the world. 2.2 million, about 800,000 more than China, which has 1 billion more people. Okay? Now, that's even if we exclude China, we have far more than any other country around, right? So the reason I say exclude China is because they have secret prisons. And instead of incarcerating people, they use corporal punishment. So this isn't to say that China is doing it better than we are. It's just to say that's a huge country relative to us, and we're outdoing them on this measure. We can look at the rate of incarceration, and the countries, we dominate all of them, but the ones that we are close to, we don't want to be compared with, right? Like that's not the well-developed democracies typically. The Onion. 15 years in an environment of constant fear somehow fails to rehabilitate prisoner. It's funny because it's true, and that makes it tragic. And the idea that maybe rehabilitation and rehabilitative ideals should be implemented, even I'm like a hard-hearted economist, let's think about this. There's very practical benefits to developing more rehabilitative plans, non-incarceration type sentences. So I'm a fan of these alternative drug treatment programs and stuff. No one would design the California American prison system the way that it exists today. So let's be willing to entertain changes and maybe more radical changes if we want to try to address some of these problems like the prison gangs. Now, started off the talk by saying that I care about rules. And so as an economist, when I talk to economists who don't know much about prisons, they don't care too much about prisons, they say, why should we still care about what your research is on? And I think that it's an interesting case study to look at prison, because some of the key things that characterize other communities are absent here. There's no right of exit. If I don't like the restaurant we go to tonight, I can never go to it again. I have the right of exit. That potential for exit controls that restaurant's ability to, provide me poor service. That's absent in prison. On average, people in prison have less self-control. They come from lower socioeconomic, they have less education. I think they're more willing to violate commonly held rules, laws on average than people in the general community. So we should expect those people to be less cooperative. This was an opportunity, studying the history of the informal community in prison is a way to try to see, well, in this particular case that has important constraints, what happens? One is that we confirm the idea that norms don't scale well. It's possible that they would if you could use violence, but it doesn't. It doesn't require great wealth. So if we judge gangs as being effective at providing the foundations for trade, that we don't need a big infuse of foreign aid to make that happen. It's all about the structuring the incentives of interactions that provides the good payoff. To the extent that they reduce violence, we don't have to think that the community is biased and could never make improvements in social order. And then finally, this is a way to study an order that wasn't created. The inmates didn't get together and vote that we want to have a community responsibility system. There wasn't a lever that was pulled. This is an evolutionary process, right? This is an ecological process that's grown, emerged, and evolved over many years. And so solutions to that should bear that in mind. So at that point, I'll stop, and if anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to entertain them. Yes, sir.
So if smaller prisons are easier to control, and then you talk about the security threat level 1, 2, and 3, I want to assume the third group is the largest of the population, they affiliate by race. Would you advocate for racially segregated prisons?
To clarify, there's 2 types of security threat groups, and the third are just other inmates. But in California, they do affiliate with these racial and ethnic groups. I don't think that that's a good choice, to racially segregate prisons. One is that the state of California tried that when these gangs were first emerging, and what it did was strengthen the control that gangs have. You see the same thing in Brazilian prisons, Bolivian prisons, they're segregated by gang, so that there's no opportunity to opt out. In California, at least, you can associate with the religious community, with a religious group, the churchgoers. You can spend time with people who are getting education. There's non-gang groups to affiliate with. I think putting people into an environment where gangs were the only option is it's the opposite failure of the suppression strategies. It's focusing on the supply side, and instead of trying to weaken it, strengthen it. And we don't want to do supply side. We need to focus on why inmates. What are the needs that inmates have? Yeah, yes.
Dollars and cents, is it financially beneficial for the prisons to have fewer riots and fewer fights? Is it worth the cost of building more small prisons?
And that sort of was part B of my question, is that if inmate populations have increased, and then the presence of gangs have caused an increase in violence, doesn't it seem like we have a better solution?
So, I think that what we can say from the evidence is that the violence has decreased at the same time that gangs have become more prominent. A lot of other stuff has changed in there as well. So I can't attribute all of that 94% decline because of gangs, right? Dollars and cents is the big issue. The question is, how much do we value crime control on the community? How much should we care about people who must associate with a group that has little to no accountability and values greed and power over other ideals? What I am, I guess, in favor of is, to the best of our abilities, taking into account all of the benefits and all of the costs of any policy. And right now, I think a lot of those costs aren't borne. I don't think that when they are designing prisons, they're taking due consideration for the structures that I think are going to exist in those communities. If we start counting those as costs, then that's going to offset the benefits, and we should do less of it. It's a very difficult problem to kind of come down to literally dollars and cents and to estimate this stuff. It absolutely has to be in the discussion, in my opinion, and I think that it's not nearly enough. I don't think that when they're making decisions about prison policy in Sacramento, for example, that they know or care about these other types of costs. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Did you find any difference in the numbers between, I'm assuming California has private prisons as well, between corporate prison structures versus state prison structures? In other words, there's differences because, private prisons they're more about the bottom line, they're streamlining, they're doing what they can versus kind of the bloated bureaucracy that goes on the state government.
My sense from reading the studies on private prisons is that on average they perform about as well as public prisons. Sharon Dolovich is a prison scholar in the law school at UCLA. She's got a great article in the Duke Law Review, and she says, let's not be wrong. That the private prisons aren't worse. They're as good as the public prisons, and that's not good enough. So I don't think there's a substantial variation in quality for private versus public prisons, and we see prison gangs in both of those settings. What's different is that the inmates who go into private prisons tend to be lower security levels. And if lower security levels associated with less demand for, say, hardcore drugs and alcohol, then that absence of demand means there's not going to be as serious of a prison gang problem in those facilities. But I think the potential for problems exists regardless of the two. Yes?
Does the length of the sentence have a factor in someone's vigor or enthusiasm for being involved?
I think that's absolutely true. I think people are more willing to kind of increase the level of their affiliation with the length of their sentence. What's interesting to me is to think about how the length of sentence affects the social order or lack thereof in a community. And if you have lots of people who follow the same rules for a long time, there's a kind of a persistence, a permanence, and a stability that can emerge. Look at a place like a county jail where people serve less than a year or they're waiting to go on trial, haven't been convicted yet, and there's substantial turnover in those county jails. There's very little ability for even these sort of gang-based structures to exert the amount of control that they do in state prisons because there's so much changing. One exception to that is the Men's Central Jail in Los Angeles, where the gang presence is so solidified that there is substantial exertion of stability and control.
So outside of the smaller prisons, I mean, what do you believe is like the best way to make prisons safer right now?
I just got back from California where I did a few talks and visited with family, and my little niece is 2 years old and she has like a GoPro camera. Cameras are just remarkably cheap, and especially in California and many of the older prisons, there are a lot of places there's just not cameras there, and they're cheap. Let's just put one up there. I mean, a big problem is if someone's assaulted in prison, they won't say who did it. Let's take that out of their hands and say, we've got the video, we know who did it. And I'm less concerned about privacy in prison because I don't think there's any privacy in prison. So I'm much more willing, let's install a bunch of cameras, let's send the feeds to some third party in addition to officials. So let's get the Red Cross in charge of prison monitoring. You know, in the UK we have a chief inspector, which is a body that's designed to kind of be the check to the prison body. I think we need to incorporate more, those are technological changes that at very low cost we could implement. I think that people are hesitant to adopt them, and if we don't care about some of the costs, then they're maybe not worth it. But yeah, we could strap a couple cameras on drones and have them randomly flying around prisons. Yeah, yes?
How does the expansion of gangs reflect on the community that gangs are coming from? Are gang ties stronger now that they're stronger in prisons and outside communities?
Yeah, so the prison gangs absolutely have a cost outside of prison, and that's one of those costs that we're not, in my opinion, fully accounting for when deciding criminal justice issues. Yeah, in Los Angeles, you know, prison gangs tax the drug sales of street gangs. They provide governance services to them. They adjudicate disputes for them. They promote illicit activity on the street. We need to incorporate those costs into what we're doing. They absolutely take place in systematic ways. So it's very real there. Another related issue is to think of the reverse, which is how much does your activity on the street influence your choice to join a gang? And clearly there is, in certain communities, encouragement that if you want to be really good, you know, the elite of the street gang world become prison gang members. But studies show that the majority of people who join prison gangs weren't in street gangs, right? So this isn't just a solution for those people who are already associated with that life.
Do you see the movement of legalization of marijuana, like Colorado, Washington, these other places looking at it? How's that going to affect the prison populations and the gangs?
So, I mean, I think I think that 20% of the prison growth since the 1980s is due to the drug war. If you get rid of that, if you were to snap your fingers and say none of those offenders would be in prison if it weren't for the drug offense, that still puts us at far higher incarceration rate than other countries. So it's part of the problem, but it's not the only one. I think ways in which it would mitigate the prison gang problem is that when these prison gangs tax street gangs, that's a revenue source that makes them better off, and they're not going to be able to tax the Walgreens or traditional legitimate places from doing it. To the extent that we're incarcerating fewer people who have a demand for drugs, there's less demand for the governance that gangs profit from providing. Any sort of deregulation or legalization of, there's a lot of ramifications, but that's my first sense about speculation about how it would cut this particular issue. Yeah.
So since we're looking at this economically, would you say that the idea of consumers' taste changing or even consumer choice could be affected by the actual harshness of sentences or the laws for sentencing. So in other words, if you're having a harsh, like 3 strikes, for example, or if you have a harsher sentence here than another state or even country, that limits your choice. So you kind of have to put yourself in that situation where you want to join a gang, as opposed to, you know, if you beat someone or stab someone, you know, what's ad saying if you got 25 years ahead of them versus say like 3.
Right. So I think the length of sentences is crucial to the individual decision calculus of how much and in what ways to affiliate. People don't join prison gangs when they're in county jail for a DUI, right? You know, like, I'm going to be out tomorrow, 2 days. Like the same thought process isn't involved there. So I don't know if I would describe it as changing preferences, but it's certainly changing the incentives and the choice on whether to kind of take a step forward, closer, or farther back. I think that the evidence shows that the deterrent value of longer and longer sentences is small, non-existent, and shrinking. So the big payoff for crime control is in the first few years, not the 21st year. So shorter sentences, smaller prisons, but not at the same time affecting crime levels too much. Yeah. Yes.
As to the structure of the prison gangs, particularly the racial divisions, it looks like we had prison gangs starting to form around the late 50s, right when the civil rights movement was really starting to be seen. And then immediately post-Civil Rights Act passing, we had a huge spike in prison population and race divided gangs. Obviously during that time, we had a lot of upheaval as far as public schools and courts. Did prisons go through similar upheaval, and yes or no, do you think it had any kind of effect on the presence of race-based gangs?
Yeah, so great question. I think the answer is absolutely. There was disheaval amongst inmates along racial lines during that time. I think that helps explain why it is kind of race and ethnic based. It's clearly a part of it. What's also interesting is that with the passage of the Civil Rights Act, is that gave a lot more freedom for inmates to make legal complaints about prison conditions. And the Supreme Court started getting very comfortable at the federal level of being involved with state level institutions like schools, mental health facilities, and prisons. So they became much more willing to tell prison officials that they can't be as punitive and as severe. And I think that has an important influence on opening up the arena in which self-governance may be needed. So if people can never leave their cell and will be beaten at a whim and officials are not accountable to anybody, that is a check on inmate autonomy. So as legal advances push that back, it might have opened up more opportunity. I don't think we shouldn't have done it. I think, yeah. So, yes?
How do racially mixed gangs affect the hierarchy in the structure? In Colorado, my friends who were in the West, they were black, white, and Hispanic. So how would that affect?
I guess the short answer is I'm not sure, because I haven't studied that case very much. It also depends on whether or not we're talking about a community responsibility system, which is very much about, all right, who's responsible for you, distinguished from people who are like actively engaged in, say, the underground economy. And for organizational issues, kind of multi-racial gangs are less of a problem. It's that the question, I guess, would be interesting to me is what at that broad least level of affiliation does it matter or not, or how do they distinguish which group they're with? There's nothing that says that it has to be racially and ethnically organized. I think sometimes in places that may be the most obvious thing. In places like Brazil, maybe just getting a tattoo of your gang affiliation on your forehead is the easiest way to distinguish people. So any other questions? No? Well, thank you very much. Enjoyed talking to you.